Member of Sherith Israel since 2010.
Whoa.
And I am very, very honored to have recently become the president of the League. The League of Sherith Israel began in 1909. So I walk on very, very broad shoulders, and I'm very, very excited about this new venture that we are all coming back to. We have not had a League event since 2019, so pre-pandemic. This is our first, and we are more than honored to have all of you here today. And I would like to introduce our rabbinic intern here at Sherith Israel, Mr. Roberto Levi, who will introduce our program this afternoon.
Thank you, Laurent. I'm very excited. Buon pomeriggio, as we would say, good afternoon in Italy. I have been a member of Sherith Israel since 2024. I'm very excited to speak to you today to introduce two very special people, special friends of mine. One, a very old friend, recently rediscovered, and one, a very new friend who is very dear to us today. I want to introduce first and foremost my friend Simone Sommer. Simone and I go way back. I was in middle school when Simone came for a gap year, or was it 2 years? 1 year, gap year to Maimonides in Boston. But I knew Simone's family already from the before times. My family was a rabbinic family in Italy at the same time that his family was a rabbinic family in Italy. Simone's father is Rav Sommer, who is the chief rabbi of Turin, and also was in New York for some time. And in the 1990s, some of you might remember, he used to frequent Sherith Israel. And he's probably, I think it's fair to say, the most learned rabbi on the Italian peninsula. He's written many books, and you can find them in your local Italian Judaica store. So good reading. You might need a dictionary, but they're very worthwhile. As for Simone, he's a pretty big shot now. He's a journalist. He is the adjunct professor, and he's an adjunct professor in the Department of Speech and Communication at Touro University. Recently, Touro University, I understand, as it was Touro College, and now they're a university, so it's very exciting. And the content marketing manager for the US market at Skit AI, an industry-leading tech company developing conversational voice artificial intelligence. He's also written a lot of articles and books, and you can find all of Simone's stuff on the wonderful internet. You might need a dictionary for some of it though. Unless you are, of course, planning on taking our next Sherith Israel League event, which will be a intensive seminar in Italian in Tuscany at a winery, exactly. And of course, Roberto Levi, who's my new friend, who sits right in front of me in the Italian row at Sherith Israel. I was told that it's the Italian row because in the 1930s, many Jews came from Italy to the United States, and so many Yekas and Italians, so many German Jews and Italian Jews, who I can imagine the meeting of these two polar opposite cultures in one space. Must have been something to behold. And they had to add 2 whole rows to the synagogue. So those 2 front rows, when you see in the main sanctuary, if you'll get a chance later. That was way earlier? All right, well, it's a good story. But regardless, so Dr. Levi sits in front of me, and I was so excited to meet someone from the Italia, what the rabbis call the Island of Divine Dew, that lovely place that all of us who end up can never seem to escape. And his history, which I think needs no introduction because we're gonna hear so much of it today through Simone's voice, through his skill as a journalist and as an interpreter. We're gonna take out that story and really examine it and see not only the story of a lost culture, but also a story of a reborn culture and a culture that endures today, and also of an amazing individual who we're all so blessed to have in our lives. Without further ado, Dr. Roberto Levi and Simone Sommer.
gonna try without the microphone. Do you prefer that I use the microphone?
You're okay.
Okay, so it's an honor. Thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to have this conversation with our special guest today at Sherit Israel. So thank you all for joining us. Our guest today is Dr. Roberto Levi, a member of this congregation and a distinguished professor of pharmacology at Cornell here in New York. He's originally from Italy, where he and his family survived the Holocaust almost 80 years ago. And today we'll hear about the Levi's pre-war life in Milan, their escape to a tiny village in the Alps during the Nazi occupation of Italy, the liberation of Italy from the Nazis, life in post-war Italy, both in Milan and Florence, and then his arrival here in the United States. So Dr. Levi has been living in New York since 1966, but he's remained deeply connected to his Italian roots, his Italian friends, and also the Italian family, the brave Italian family who hid his family and himself during the war. So let's start with a very easy question. Tell me about your connection to this congregation, to this community, Sherit Israel.
I try to speak without the microphone if you prefer. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Okay. So I think the connection with Sherit Israel started really in 1946 when I was a teenager in Milan, and I remember my parents inviting for lunch a couple of friends of theirs. One was Giuseppe Calabi, and the other one was Fausto Pitigliani. And they were both members of the Sephardic synagogue, of the Sherit Israel. And during the lunch, we talked about they were talking about how beautiful the services were, how interesting the people of the congregation were. And that was the first time I ever heard of Sherit Israel. So when I came to New York in 1966, I was living on the east side. It was easier to go to Parkey Synagogue, and so that's where I started. But my parents came to visit in 1968, and 2 years later, and for Friday evening we came here, and they enjoyed it very much, and they said, that's where you should come. Here I am.
Speaking of, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, speaking of your parents, let's go to the very beginning. I'm curious to hear about those early years in Milan. I know your father was the general manager of San Pellegrino. Tell me about those first years of your life.
Yes, San Pellegrino, my father started working at San Pellegrino in 1934, the year I was born. So it has been very important in my life at the beginning. I used to go to visit my father at the factory, learn how they bottle water and they make it fizzy. But the most important fact of San Pellegrino was the fact that there was one employee who was actually the one who managed to hit us for 2 years during the war. And he was working in Milan. Milan had been bombed seriously, so many people, the ones that could possibly leave Milan, left, and to try to avoid being bombed. And we, in 1942 actually, we went outside of Milan. My grandparents had a house, sort of a country house that was 40 kilometers out of Milan, so very, very, and we were there, a place called Tradate, and there were several Jews there, including Sally Meyer, who was the owner of a major paper factory, and he survived the Holocaust. He became the president of the Jewish community in Milan, and there is a Jewish school named after him now. And I think that you know about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so San Pellegrino was a source of not only they continued paying the salary to my father even though we were away in hiding. And Luigi Mosca, who was the person who hid us, was actually coming back and forth. He was working in Milan and coming on the weekends, was coming, brought us the money, food stamps. Of course, we were living under another name. We couldn't possibly live under the name Levi. So, so they were extremely good, I should say, the San Pellegrino factory. But particularly the Moscas, Lino Mosca and his wife, who were the ones who actually provided us, found us a house where we were living. And so they saved us, and years later, they were recognized by the Yad Vashem.
Yes, and we'll get to it. I want to hear about your father a little bit. What kind of person was he, and what was his connection, relationship with the Jewish community there in Milan?
Well, my father was very Jewish. He had been educated by a rabbi by the name of Alessandro D'Afano, who was a relatively famous rabbi in Italy, and actually the school that I went to was named after him. It was the D'Afano school in Milan, before it became the Sali Maria school. So my father was very interested in Hebraism. It was his father too. My grandfather on the paternal side was from Emilia-Romagna, and he had several members of their family. There was a senator in Alcester who actually was member of the Italian government. There were some relatives that converted to the Catholicism, and I know absolutely nothing about them because they were totally excluded. When my father was asked, "Do you have any parents, any relatives by name Levi?" He says, "Only one in Israel." Okay. Classical response.
Who was his brother who had made Aliyah,
yes.
Right? My question, did you or your father, did you go to synagogue in Milan?
Yeah, we used to go quite often, not every Saturday, but definitely for the holidays. I used to accompany him washing the hands of the Kohanim. That was a very interesting thing. I never done it here, so I miss it. Maybe whoever that hears me. Okay.
It's a pleasure.
But he was sitting on a seat that had the name of his father still, and right now I'm sitting on a site that has my name near Alex's name. So.
And this was the synagogue in Via della Guastalla, right? Which is very central, quite not too far from the Duomo.
Yes.
Which you told me was bombed during World War II.
Was totally destroyed during the war. So after the war, the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue, was housed in an old fascist home, it was a very large room that served both as a synagogue and a place where the refugees from Eastern Europe would come and for a few nights before going either to the US or South America or mostly to Israel, trying to go to Israel.
We mentioned your brother. Did your father ever think about, sorry, your uncle, I apologize, your uncle, did your father ever consider making Aliyah?
Well, there was a point in 1937, 38, 39 when it was obvious that many of the Italian Jews were leaving the country. On my mother's side, her sister left for Argentina. My uncle, well, I must say that both my father and my uncle were extremely Zionist since the very beginning. So for my uncle, it was really his dream to. He had gone to university. He had an engineering degree in electrical engineering. So he decided to go to what was called Palestine in those days. And he did very well, I mean, particularly after the war. Sorry. I don't know exactly how he survived during World War II. I know that they were extremely scared during World War II because when the Germans were advancing in North Africa and they entered Egypt, they were very afraid that they would come up. So they had plans to try to escape to Lebanon. That fortunately never happened because General Montgomery managed to stop the invasion of the Middle East by the Nazis. But so my father eventually decided to stay in Italy. There were some talks of going to some country in South Africa. I don't remember even the name. That didn't last too long. They considered going to Argentina as well. Sorry. And so we stayed in Italy. Of course, during the war, it was terrible because our relatives in Argentina or in Israel didn't know absolutely anything about us. And after the war, I still remember very vividly the return, first of my aunt. And I remember we went to the station, to the central station in Milan. She was coming from Paris by train. She had taken a plane from Buenos Aires to Paris that took, I don't know, 36 hours, something like that. There were propeller planes. And then she took the train, and it was the summer of '46. And my grandparents were still alive. It was a very, very emotional.
Very moving moment to reconnect.
Yes. And then when my uncle first came, that was a few months later, and I hardly remembered him because he had left when I was about 4 years old. And it was a very interesting man. I liked him very much.
So in 1938, the fascist government in Italy promulgated these racial laws, which de facto excluded Jewish people from a lot of the public sphere. They were barred from doing certain jobs, and also everyone who was attending public schools or public universities was forced to leave. You were too young to be in school yet, but your sister was already in school.
Yeah, my sister was 5 years older. She was already in public school, and she was one day suddenly she said, she tried to go to school and the doors were closed for Jews. So fortunately, there were enough Jews in Milan to organize a school that started from, there was no kindergarten, it was just from first grade all the way up to the end of the high school.
Were the teachers Jewish teachers
Of
that
course, they
had
did.
to leave the public schools?
Yeah, they were leaving the public schools, and so the school was excellent. We had the top of the screen, really, in terms of. And what happened? I continued after the war. I continued to the same school, and had a wonderful time. And when my father moved to Florence, the whole family moved to Florence. I'm sorry. At the end, was almost at the end of my high school, next to last year, I finally went to public school.
Yeah.
So, with the interruption of 3 years during the war, in which I didn't go to school at all. I was schooled by two teachers in the mountains in a very interesting way. I learned a lot from them, but it was just Italian. There was no math, nothing else.
So your parents were very attached to Italy. Was that I imagine it must have been a really big shock to the racial laws in 1938.
Yes.
And how did your family adjust to that change?
Well, fortunately, my father continued to work at San Pellegrino. They kept him there. But all the professors and all the engineers and all the lawyers and all the professional people couldn't have a job. You couldn't have any servants unless they were Jewish. You couldn't have a radio. There were many things that you were, all the real estate was confiscated. So it was kind of, and as a child playing with children that were not Jewish, it was clear that they looked at me in a different way.
Yes.
And with a name like Levi, it was clear who I was.
Right.
Ridiculously enough, my first name, Roberto, was popular, and for the fascists, because the fascists were allied with the Germans and the Japanese. And so my name was Rome, Berlin, Tokyo.
Wow.
So I was popular. I remember I was going to a gym, and when they heard Roberto, they said, "Oh yes, the gym was not Jewish." Roberto, of course, Rome, Berlin, Tokyo. Of course, that's exactly what I wanted to hear.
So it's 43, and you were only the Germans, the Nazi regime occupies northern and central Italy, and it
Yes.
becomes clear to your parents that it's not safe anymore to just live in your house.
Yeah,
in
we
Milan.
were living in this little town, Tradate. There were some other Jews. Some of them, unfortunately, were taken to Auschwitz, including the Rabbi Castel Bolognese, who was a very good friend of my father, and he was taken from Tradate, where we were, and we never heard anything out about him after that. So there had been a major incident where the Nazis killed several families of Italian Jews in an area near where we were in hiding. They actually drowned them in one of the lakes of northern Italy. And when the news spread out, I remember my mother telling my father, we have to get out of here. So we thought of going to Switzerland, where many northern Jews went to. It was not possible. And then finally, this opportunity happened.
Thanks to Lino Mosca of San Pellegrino, who was this colleague of your father.
Yes.
And he arranged your escape. You escaped
We
to
escaped,
Valmosca, this tiny village in the Alps, which we'll talk about in a second. But tell me about that escape, because you were only 9 years old, but you have very vivid memories of that trip.
It was a very interesting trip because we tried we left very early in the morning. It might have been 4 or 5 in the morning, and we tried to take as many trains as possible to go to this place. It was during the war, so the trains already were kind of rare and scarce. So we took a list, 1, 2, 3, 4 trains, different trains, and we sat in different cars, because we didn't want to sit together and let people know. And there was a story that my sister always reminds me. It says, "Do you remember that we there wasn't much food, so we tried to bring some food with us. And among this food there was a very stinky piece of cheese, and we left a sort of a trail of this cheese smell. And thinking retrospectively, when I speak to my sister, it says, "Remember, it was early October." It says, "Remember the trail of cheese?" But we still had some cheese left when we get to Valmosca. Valmosca was far away. There was no public transportation, so there was a little electric train It took us about 4 kilometers from there, and then we walked. And we had some suitcases. Some of the women, of the local women, came to help us. It was a women's society, because basically it was so poor that all the men were out of the country working and had been blocked outside because of the war. So it was a women's society, and they used to carry incredible weights, cut trees. They used to do all the things that normally men do. So they helped us. We got installed in this house. This house was owned by a very old lady. She was in her mid-90s. She was almost blind, but she didn't know anything, who we were or anything else. So, but the Moscas had arranged for us to, and we paid a little rent. I don't know the details, but it was and I went to revisit the house several times after the war.
You did.
Yeah.
So we must imagine this very tiny and quite isolated village in a higher valley in the Alps near the town of Biella,
Yes,
and which is in Piedmont. And you said something to me the other day. You told me it would have been impossible. It was less than 100 people living in this town, and you said it would have been impossible to hide a family without the tacit agreement of the entire population.
Yes, there were at least a couple of people that knew who we were. One was a neighbor. Her name was Maurina. We became very good friends. Her husband was a Marine officer, and he had got stranded in Venezuela. He couldn't leave, and so she was alone with 2 kids. One was my age, Piero, and the other one was Renzo, was a little younger. And with Piero, we had a very good friendship. We played together. He was kind of a churchy guy, and he loved going to church. He was showing me all these memorabilia about this Holy Communion and everything.
Right.
And he wanted to play to make a trash, for Christmas and everything else. So it was an interesting situation. And but the mother knew who we were, and it happened that we had a couple months after we were in the valley, there was an incident in which a lot of Nazi troopers came up, and they were trying to find an anarchist who was living in the village, who then was found and killed. And there is actually a very nice plaque on the village now with his name. It was also called Moscow. Almost everybody was called Moscow in Valmosca.
So there were rough years. It was hard to get food.
Yeah.
It was also very cold. You didn't really have.
Very cold. We had a stove. We had a stove with. We collected the wood for the stove, but there was no.
Right.
Yeah.
But how did you? I know you managed to continue your education here and there,
Yeah.
thanks to your father and a few other young people.
Yeah, my father was teaching me Hebrew, a little bit English, and a little bit of French, and then these 2 sisters, they taught me Italian, poetry mostly, no Latin, no Greek. That came afterwards.
Later. How did you stay informed? Were you at all aware of what was going on in Italy, in the rest of Europe, and also to Jews in Europe?
Well, Jews in Europe, we only heard that they are taking them to Poland. That was, quote unquote, that's all what we knew. And we knew of some families that had been killed by the fascists or the Nazis previously. There were some newspapers that used to come. I remember December 2nd of 1943, there was this huge title that said the Jews have to go to the authorities and be. And I remember that my grandmother, who was with us during those years, was extremely upset. And she said, we have to do it. And her father said, no way.
No way.
No way, absolutely not. That's the craziest thing to do.
Right. The last few months there were particularly tough. There was a lot of fighting between the partisans and the Repubblichini, who were the soldiers fighting on behalf of the fascist, of Hitler's puppet government in Salò. So at one point, you told me in January and February of 1945, the Repubblichini even managed to gain control of the valley.
Oh, the valley, yes.
And at that point, you couldn't leave your house. It was too dangerous, right?
It was too dangerous. We were, most of the time, we were in, except maybe trying to go and get some food or some stuff. I remember once with my mother, we were stopped at a block by the fascists. And of course, my parents had fake IDs, but my father's had a good one. He made him born in Barletta, which is all the way down in Puglia. And the reason why I was born in Barletta was because it was occupied by the Allies, so they couldn't possibly check whether
the census.
And my mother's was born in Pescara, which was just on the line, but my mother's documents were not too good. They were not very well counterfeited. So we had a very scary moment. They held us for about 45 minutes or so, and then finally they let us out. But I remember it was really hard. This was either January or February of 45.
And how did you learn that Italy had been liberated? Was it through the radio?
Well, yes, we mostly listened to Radio London. There was the neighbors had it. They kept it all the way in the basement so that it couldn't be heard, because it was very highly disturbata. How do you say that?
There was a lot of interference?
There's a lot of interference that was made by the fascists, so that number one, it was difficult to hear it. Number two, it was loud enough that if people heard it, it was clear that we were listening to Radio London, and immediately fingered as somebody who...
Right, because it was used also by the resistance.
It was used by the resistance.
Coded messages and...
Coded messages, very strange messages like l'autunno è freddo, the fall is cold. And that meant that they were, dropping by parachute, they were dropping stuff for the resistance,
Aid, yeah. So you learned, how was that day, that moment when you learned that Italy had been
Well, we
liberated?
heard, we knew that things were happening. I think the very first thing that we heard was that the resistance had declared a general strike in northern Italy. And I didn't understand that the general strike really meant that everybody was leaving the factories and going into the streets to revolt against the Germans and the fascists.
Yeah.
So we knew that was coming. But then finally we heard that northern Italy had been liberated even before the Allies arrived. And that's what is celebrated now as the April 25th, which is a debated holiday in Italy these days, unfortunately, because of the fascist government that is
Right, it's Festa della Liberazione.
exactly.
After the war, you spent a few months in Biella to attend school there, and then you reached your parents in Milan. And how was post-war Milan, and how was it to gradually learn more about what had happened in the Holocaust?
Yeah, it was little by little we started knowing exactly what had happened. I remember going to to a documentary presentation of a documentary. My parents were actually trying to cover.
Your eyes.
Sorry.
It's okay. We can move on.
Trying to cover my eyes because they didn't want me to see.
To see. Do you remember anything from your bar mitzvah?
My bar mitzvah was in 1947. It was Milan was half dark because there was not enough power, electric power. So it was celebrated by the light of what is called carburo. I don't know what it is. It's a gas that is cheap gas. And I still remember my sister and I used to kid that the following day there would be a line on the newspaper saying two kids blown up by one of those lamps. We used to laugh about it.
When the time came, we're almost at time, but I really want to get to the conclusion of the story. When the time came to, so first of all, your family moved, after a few years later, your family moved to Florence, where your father received a job offer to be kind of the general manager of Fila, the pencil factory. And you moved to Florence, where you started attending Liceo Michelangelo, a public high school. And how did you decide what to study in university?
Well, that was interesting. I started loving science when I was in high school in Milan, but it wasn't clear what I wanted to do. We had a very interesting teacher that sort of taught me the beginning, you know, the skeleton, the various organs, etc., etc. I was fascinated by that. And then science in Florence, no, it was no good. No math, no science. It was mostly classical lycée, lots of English, lot of Latin, a lot of Greek. 8 years of Latin and 5 of Greek. Translations directly from Greek into Latin. And it was a lot of history of art, of course. But so my father loved the engineering because his brother was an engineer. He says, why don't you think about engineering? So I ended up in the engineering school and didn't like math at all. This goes for my granddaughter who's a math.
And your father also told you, don't study law because we're Jewish and we have to be able to move around as needed.
That was one of his things.
So after 1 year of engineering, you're like,
No,
I'm good.
It was actually one of the professor of analysis mathematica, as they call it. It was
Calculus.
who told me, he says, Levi, he called me my last name, you're in the wrong. Why don't you try to do something else? And I did. So at this point, my father was convinced that I could do whatever I liked. So I went to medical school.
Years later, you got the opportunity to move to Baltimore on a postdoctoral fellowship with Fulbright, and that's where you kind of...
Yeah, what happened was that I did when I was, in Italy, medical school is 6 years, so it includes college and medical school together. So there was one particular discipline, which was pharmacology in the 4th year, that I really liked. I really fell in love with it. So I did an honors thesis in that, worked in pharmacology after I graduated in medicine for 1 year, and then had the opportunity to come to the US for a postdoctoral fellowship that was at Hopkins. So, those were the years of the thin cows in Italy and the fat cows in the US. So science was applied, was supported largely by the federal government. Everything was organized, and I loved it. And I really loved it. So I had the opportunity to come back, but I didn't have the visa to come back. So I had to wait 2 years, at least 2 years. I waited 3, and then I came back. I had several offers somewhere in pharmaceutical industry, somewhere universities, but my wife wanted to come to New York.
New York. So Baltimore was okay, but New York was the real deal, right? So you stayed in touch with the Moscas, and my last question is really about that, about the relationship with the Moscas over the years, and also in 2012, you stated before, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, awarded Lino and his wife Maria Mosca righteous the righteous, they named them righteous among the nations, and they gave a medal to their daughter Elena, who was there while you were hiding. She was kind of your sister's age, right? And the ceremony was held in Valmosca.
There was this incredible ceremony. I have a book with photographs. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend. And my sister were there, all of her family, and the Moscas, they had passed away, but Elena was there. And the ceremony was held in this little church, San Biagio, which is the one where I used to go and make believe
to blend in.
To blend in, exactly. I never served mass. I wouldn't know how to do it. But anyway, so there was a beautiful ceremony. Not the ambassador, but a consul, an Israeli consul from Rome attended, and I have all the pictures that I look at very often, and so my nephew was the one who actually organized the whole, because there was a lot of documentation needed for the Yad Vashem, and and then I continued talking to Elena. Elena was in poor health. She became almost completely blind, but we still talked on the phone, and she had a very nice spirit. You know, she was a valet, as in the local dialect. She was belonging to the valley. She was a valley person, and eventually she was so ill that she was taken by a nephew to live with them, and I'm still in touch with the nephew.
With the nephew.
Yes.
Beautiful. So thank you so much for taking the time to share a small sliver of your story today with us, and I think we can all shoot. We don't have time for questions, right? We can have a couple of questions. Okay, so do we have any questions for Dr. Levi? Please.
Hi, Roberto. Did you participate in the Shoah videos in the 1990s? Did you tell your story to the USC Shoah Foundation?
No, actually, I should have. I remember flying once to the West Coast, and I was reading a Primo Levi book, and there was a woman sitting next to me that was interested, and she said, "What are you reading?" I told her what I was reading. She was from Yale, and she said, "You should definitely make a deposition for Yale, etc." She gave me the address and all the information. But unfortunately, science is a tough business. And there is very little time for other things. So I never did. I should have.
Well, we'll speak of that again, since it's obviously not too late.
Was another question here? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we are going to move on to another presentation, which I have to set up a little bit. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got to this event while I'm making this happen, or not. So before the pandemic, I had conceived of a series of events that would that would highlight the heritage of Shearith Israel. Okay, can people see it?
Yes.
I mean, maybe that corner can't see it so well.
That's okay.
Okay.